To understand how we got to the point where my family held a funeral for me while I was very much alive, I need to give you the background on my toxic family situation. I'm 34, and I've been estranged from most of my family for about 3 years now. The estrangement started when I refused to loan my brother Marcus $50,000 for his fourth failed business venture, but it really stems from decades of being the family scapegoat. My parents always favored my siblings, Marcus, who's 32, and my sister Jennifer, who's 29, while treating me like I was some kind of burden they had to tolerate. Growing up, everything was always my fault. If Marcus got bad grades, it was because I was a bad influence. If Jennifer got in trouble, it was because I wasn't being a good role model. When Marcus crashed his car in high school, somehow that was also my fault for not teaching him to be more responsible. My parents would literally blame me for things that happened when I wasn't even present, and my siblings learned early on that I was the perfect scapegoat for their own failures and mistakes. This dynamic continued into adulthood, with my family constantly expecting me to fix their problems while simultaneously treating me like garbage. Marcus has never held a job for more than 2 years and has started 5 different businesses that all failed spectacularly, but somehow he's still the golden child who can do no wrong. Jennifer has been married and divorced 3 times, each time expecting the family to pay for her weddings and then support her through the divorces. But she's still treated like a princess who deserves everything handed to her. Meanwhile, I worked my way through college, got a good job in tech, saved my money, bought a house, and built a stable life for myself. But instead of being proud of my success, my family resented me for it. They constantly made comments about how I thought I was better than them, how I was selfish for not sharing my wealth with the family, and how I needed to step up and help my siblings more. Every family gathering became an interrogation about my finances and demands that I help fund whatever crisis my siblings had created for themselves. The breaking point came 3 years ago when Marcus came to me asking for $50,000 to start yet another business. This one was going to be different, he promised. This one was going to make him rich and he'd pay me back with interest. I'd heard this story 4 times before, and I'd learned from watching him burn through my parents' retirement, savings, and Jennifer's divorce settlements that giving Marcus money was like throwing it into a black hole. I told him no, and I explained that I wasn't going to enable his pattern of financial irresponsibility anymore. Marcus went nuclear. He started screaming at me about how I was selfish and greedy, how I was abandoning my family when they needed me most, how I was no better than a stranger if I wouldn't help my own brother. He called me every name in the book and stormed out of my house, but not before telling me that I was dead to him and that the family would never forgive me for turning my back on them in their time of need. Within days, my parents were calling to yell at me for refusing to help Marcus. They said I was being cruel and vindictive, that family was supposed to stick together, and that I was obviously too selfish and materialistic to understand what family loyalty meant. Jennifer joined in, telling me that I was heartless and that she was ashamed to call me her brother. They painted me as the villain in this story, completely ignoring the fact that I'd already lent Marcus money 3 previous times and never saw a penny of it back. The campaign against me escalated quickly. My parents started telling extended family members that I had refused to help Marcus and was causing problems for the whole family. They twisted the story to make it sound like Marcus was facing some kind of desperate situation and I was refusing to help out of pure spite. Cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone started calling to tell me how disappointed they were in me and how I needed to do the right thing and help my brother. When I tried to explain my side of the story, nobody wanted to hear it. They'd already decided that I was the bad guy, and nothing I said was going to change their minds. Family gatherings became hostile environments where I was either ignored completely or subjected to passive-aggressive comments about family loyalty and responsibility. It became clear that I wasn't welcome anymore, so I stopped attending family events altogether. The estrangement deepened over the following months. My parents would call occasionally, but only to guilt-trip me about Marcus or to ask for money for some new crisis. Jennifer would text me angry messages about how I was tearing the family apart and how I needed to apologize and make things right. Marcus just pretended I didn't exist, which was honestly a relief because his presence in my life had always been toxic anyway. What really hurt was realizing that none of them actually cared about me as a person. They only cared about what I could do for them financially. Once I stopped being their personal ATM, they had no use for me at all. It was painful, but also liberating to understand that the family relationships I'd been trying to maintain were completely one-sided and transactional. I threw myself into my work and started building new relationships with people who actually valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. I started dating seriously for the first time in years, made new friends through work and hobbies, and generally began building the life I wanted rather than the life my family expected me to live. It was actually the happiest I'd been in years, once I stopped trying to please people who were never going to be pleased anyway. But my family wasn't content to just let me live my life in peace. They continued their campaign to paint me as the villain, telling anyone who would listen about how I'd abandoned my family and refused to help when they needed me most. They were particularly vocal about this at family gatherings and community events, making sure everyone knew what a terrible person I was. It was like they needed to justify their treatment of me by convincing everyone else that I deserved it. This brings us to about 8 months ago, when my grandfather, my dad's father, passed away at the age of 89. Grandpa Joe had always been the one family member who treated me fairly and didn't expect me to fix everyone else's problems. He was a tough old guy who believed in hard work and personal responsibility, and he'd never been impressed with Marcus's excuses or Jennifer's drama. I was devastated by his death, not just because I loved him, but because he was the last family member who actually seemed to care about me as a person. The funeral was awkward, to say the least. I attended because I wanted to pay my respects to Grandpa Joe, but my family made it clear that I wasn't really welcome there. They were civil enough in public, but I could feel the hostility radiating from them. Marcus wouldn't even look at me. Jennifer made snide comments under her breath, and my parents treated me like I was some distant acquaintance they barely knew. After the funeral, there was the matter of Grandpa Joe's will. He'd been pretty well off. He'd owned a successful construction business for decades and had invested wisely over the years. Everyone expected him to split his estate between his 3 children, including my father. What nobody expected was what actually happened when the lawyer read the will. Grandpa Joe had left the bulk of his estate, about $800,000 total, to me. His reasoning, as stated in the will, was that I was the only grandchild who had shown the responsibility and work ethic that he valued, and he wanted to make sure his legacy went to someone who would use it wisely rather than waste it on failed ventures and poor decisions. He left smaller amounts to Marcus and Jennifer, $25,000 each, and some family heirlooms to my parents, but the majority of his wealth came to me. The reaction from my family was explosive. They were absolutely furious that Grandpa Joe had rewarded my selfishness and family abandonment with his inheritance. Marcus started screaming about how unfair it was, how I'd obviously manipulated a dying old man, and how he was going to contest the will. Jennifer was crying and ranting about how Grandpa Joe must have been senile or confused because there was no way he would have chosen me over them if he'd been thinking clearly. My parents were the worst of all. They accused me of elder abuse, of isolating Grandpa Joe from the rest of the family, of poisoning his mind against his other grandchildren. They said I was a manipulative sociopath who had taken advantage of an old man's loneliness to steal money that should have gone to people who actually deserved it. The fact that I'd visited Grandpa Joe regularly while they rarely saw him apparently didn't matter. In their minds, I was obviously the villain who had stolen their inheritance through trickery and manipulation. The truth was much simpler. Grandpa Joe and I had maintained a close relationship throughout my estrangement from the rest of the family. I'd visit him regularly, not because I knew about his will, but because I genuinely enjoyed his company and respected his wisdom. He'd watched my family's treatment of me over the years, and he'd formed his own opinions about who deserved his support. The will was his final statement about family values and personal responsibility. But my family wasn't interested in the truth. They wanted their money, and they were furious that it was going to someone they'd written off as a family outcast. Marcus immediately started talking about contesting the will, claiming that I'd exercised undue influence over Grandpa Joe. Jennifer started spreading rumors that I'd isolated him from the family and manipulated him when he was vulnerable. My parents supported these claims and started talking to lawyers about challenging the inheritance. I knew the will was solid. Grandpa Joe had worked with a good lawyer and had been very clear about his intentions, but the family's threats were still stressful. I decided to take a step back from the whole situation and let the lawyers handle it. I took some time off work and went on an extended trip to Europe that I'd been planning for years. It seemed like the perfect time to get away from the family drama and let things cool down while the legal process ran its course. What I didn't know was that my family was about to take their manipulation and lies to a whole new level. While I was traveling through Italy with limited internet access, they decided to spread the story that I had died in a car accident. I'm still not entirely sure how this started or who came up with the idea, but somehow they managed to convince people that I'd been killed in a crash while driving through the Italian countryside. The story they told was that I'd been driving alone on a dangerous mountain road when I'd lost control of the car and crashed into a ravine. They said the Italian authorities had contacted them about the accident and that my body had been so badly damaged that it couldn't be recovered or returned to the United States. They claimed they'd had to handle all the arrangements from a distance and that they were planning a memorial service to celebrate my life and give people a chance to say goodbye. I learned later that Marcus had actually called my job and told them I'd been killed in the accident. He'd been very convincing, apparently, providing details about the crash and the Italian authorities' response. My company had been understanding and supportive, offering to help with any arrangements and expressing their condolences to my family. Several of my coworkers had even sent flowers and cards to my parents' house. The lies spread quickly through our extended family and social circles. Jennifer had called all of our cousins and aunts and uncles with the tragic news, and they'd spread it to their friends and neighbors. My parents had contacted my few remaining friends from high school and college, playing the role of grieving parents sharing devastating news about their son's untimely death. What made this especially manipulative was that they were using my supposed death to gain sympathy and attention for themselves. Suddenly, they were the tragic parents who had lost their son just months after losing the patriarch of the family. People were rallying around them, offering support and condolences, bringing food and flowers, and treating them like they were dealing with unimaginable grief. But the real kicker was what they did with the inheritance situation. With me supposedly dead, they started arguing that Grandpa Joe's will should be voided and his estate should pass to his surviving grandchildren. They claimed that since I'd died without children or a will of my own, the money should revert to the family and be distributed among Marcus and Jennifer. They were essentially trying to use my fake death to steal the inheritance that Grandpa Joe had specifically wanted me to have. The memorial service was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, at the same funeral home where we'd held Grandpa Joe's service months earlier. They'd sent out invitations to extended family, family friends, former coworkers, and basically anyone who had ever known me. They'd prepared a full program with photos from my childhood and young adulthood, readings about dealing with grief and loss, and even a eulogy that my father was planning to deliver about his beloved son who had been taken too soon. Meanwhile, I was completely oblivious to all of this. I was having the time of my life traveling through Europe, visiting museums and historical sites, eating amazing food, and generally enjoying my freedom from family drama. I'd been deliberately keeping my social media usage to a minimum and wasn't checking email regularly, so I had no idea that my family had declared me dead and was planning my funeral. The truth started to come out when I posted a photo from Rome on Instagram. I'd taken a selfie in front of the Colosseum and posted it with a caption about how amazing the trip was going. Within minutes, I started getting frantic comments and messages from people asking if I was alive, if I was okay, and what the hell was going on. My phone started buzzing nonstop with calls and texts from people who were apparently very confused about my current state of existence. It took me a while to piece together what had happened, but eventually, I figured out that my family had told everyone I was dead and was planning to hold a memorial service in my honor. The level of manipulation and deception was breathtaking. They'd fabricated an entire story about my death, convinced dozens of people that it was true, and were using it to try to steal my inheritance and gain sympathy for themselves. I was furious, obviously, but I was also oddly impressed by the sheer audacity of what they'd done. It was such an elaborate and committed lie that part of me almost had to admire their dedication to the deception. But mostly, I was just angry that they'd put people through the grief of thinking I was dead and that they were trying to use my supposed death to steal money that my grandfather had specifically left to me. That's when I decided that they needed to face the consequences of their lies in the most dramatic and public way possible. If they wanted to hold a funeral for me, then I was going to give them a funeral they'd never forget. I immediately booked a flight back to the United States, making sure I'd arrive just in time for the memorial service. I didn't tell anyone. I was coming. I wanted my arrival to be a complete surprise. The memorial service was scheduled to start at 2 p.m. on Saturday. I landed at the airport at 10 a.m. and drove straight to the funeral home, arriving just as people were starting to gather for the service. I parked across the street and watched as my extended family friends, former coworkers, and neighbors filed into the building to pay their respects to my memory. It was surreal watching people attend my own funeral. I could see cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, former teachers from high school, coworkers from my first job, and neighbors from my childhood home. They all looked appropriately somber and grief-stricken, clearly believing that they were there to mourn my tragic death in a foreign country. Some people were carrying flowers, others had cards or small gifts, and everyone was dressed in funeral attire. I waited until about 20 minutes after the service was supposed to start, figuring that everyone would be seated and my father would probably be in the middle of delivering his eulogy. Then I walked across the street, through the front doors of the funeral home, and straight into the memorial service. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The first person to see me was my Aunt Carol, who was sitting in the back row. She looked at me, looked away, then looked back at me with her mouth hanging open. She started making these strange, choking sounds and pointing at me like she was seeing a ghost. Within seconds, other people started turning around to see what she was pointing at, and the whispers and gasps started spreading through the room like wildfire. I walked slowly down the center aisle, making eye contact with as many people as possible. Some people were staring at me in shock. Others were rubbing their eyes like they couldn't believe what they were seeing, and a few people actually got up and left the room like they were too freaked out to stay. The whole room gradually fell silent as people realized that the guest of honor had arrived at his own memorial service. My father was standing at the podium in the middle of delivering what I'm sure was a very touching eulogy about his beloved deceased son. When he saw me walking down the aisle, he stopped mid-sentence and just stared at me with his mouth open. His face went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, shock, recognition, fear, and then something that looked like panic. Marcus and Jennifer were sitting in the front row with my parents, and their reactions were even better. Marcus actually fell off his chair when he saw me, landing on the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Jennifer started hyperventilating and had to grab onto the person next to her to keep from fainting. My mother just sat there staring at me, like I was actually a ghost coming back to haunt her. I walked all the way to the front of the room and stood directly in front of the podium where my father was still frozen in shock. The entire funeral. Home was dead silent except for the sound of people whispering and a few nervous coughs. I looked around the room at all the people who had come to mourn my death, smiled and said, "Well, this is awkward. I hear you've been having a funeral for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody knew what to say or do. Some people were clearly trying to figure out if they were hallucinating or if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Others were starting to realize that they'd been lied to and were beginning to look angry. A few people were actually crying, whether from relief that I wasn't dead or from embarrassment at being deceived. I'm not sure. My father finally found his voice and stammered something about how glad he was that I was alive and how there must have been some kind of misunderstanding about the accident in Italy. He was trying to play it off like it had all been a genuine mistake, like they'd received incorrect information and had acted in good faith based on what they'd been told. But I wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily. I told the room that there had been no accident in Italy, no contact from Italian authorities, and no misunderstanding of any kind. I explained that I'd been traveling safely through Europe and having a wonderful time, completely unaware that my family had decided to declare me dead and hold a funeral in my honor. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and intense. People started talking all at once, asking questions, demanding explanations, and expressing their outrage at being deceived. Several people got up and walked out, clearly disgusted by the whole situation. Others stayed, but were visibly angry, glaring at my parents and siblings like they wanted to strangle them. That's when I really went for the throat. I told everyone about the inheritance from Grandpa Joe, how my family had been furious that he'd left his money to me instead of them, and how they'd been trying to contest his will. I explained that my supposed death was actually part of an elaborate scheme to steal my inheritance by claiming that the will should be voided and the money should go to the surviving grandchildren. The crowd was absolutely horrified. These were people who had known my family for years, who had respected them as pillars of the community, and who had come to this service out of genuine grief and sympathy. To learn that they'd been manipulated and lied to as part of an inheritance fraud scheme was beyond what most of them could process. Marcus tried to interrupt me, claiming that I was lying and that they genuinely believed I was dead. But I was ready for this. I pulled out my phone and showed everyone the photos I'd been posting from my trip, complete with timestamps and location data that proved I'd been alive and well throughout the time they claimed I'd been dead. I also had screenshots of messages from friends asking about my supposed death, which showed exactly when the lie had started spreading. Jennifer started crying and claiming that it had all been a misunderstanding, that someone had given them false information about an accident and they'd acted on it in good faith. But her story fell apart when I pointed out that they'd had specific details about the crash, the Italian authorities, and the condition of my supposed body. Details that couldn't have come from any legitimate source because no accident had actually occurred. My parents tried to take control of the situation by asking everyone to leave so we could sort out this family misunderstanding privately. But the damage was done. Everyone in that room now knew that they'd been manipulated and deceived, and they weren't just going to forget about it and move on. Several people were taking photos and videos with their phones, clearly planning to share this story with others. But the best part was still to come. One of my former coworkers stood up and announced that she worked in the legal department of a major corporation, and that what my family had done constituted fraud on multiple levels. She said that declaring someone dead for financial gain was a serious crime, and that using that false death to try to claim inheritance money was an even more serious crime. She actually pulled out her phone and called the police right there, in the funeral home. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, just as people were starting to leave. They took statements from several attendees who confirmed that my family had told them I was dead, and they took photos of the memorial, service program, and the flowers and cards that people had brought. They also took a statement from me confirming that I was very much alive and had never been in any accident in Italy. My family tried to claim that it had all been a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. They'd told a very specific story about my death, had provided details that could only have been fabricated, and had used my supposed death to try to gain access to my inheritance. The officers explained that filing false death reports and attempting to defraud estate proceedings were serious crimes that could result in felony charges. In the end, Marcus and Jennifer were arrested for fraud and filing false reports. My parents weren't arrested that day, but they were told that they were under investigation and that charges might be filed against them as well. The whole thing made the local news, with the headline, "Family Holds Funeral for Living Man in Inheritance." Scheme appearing in the newspaper and on television. The aftermath was brutal for my family's reputation in the community. Everyone who had attended the memorial service spread the story to their friends and neighbors, and within days, it seemed like everyone in town knew what had happened. My parents went from being respected members of the community to being the people who had faked their son's death to steal money from a will. It was a level of public humiliation that they never recovered from. Marcus and Jennifer both ended up pleading guilty to reduced charges and received probation, community service, and fines. They also had to pay restitution for the costs of the memorial service and the flowers and cards that people had wasted on my fake funeral. My parents weren't criminally charged, but they were dropped by most of their friends and social organizations once the truth came out. The inheritance case was quickly resolved once it became clear that I was alive and well. Grandpa Joe's will stood as written, and I received the full amount he'd left me. I used some of the money to take an even longer trip to Asia, posting photos from every destination to make sure everyone knew I was still very much alive and enjoying life. The legal consequences were just the beginning of their punishment, though. The social consequences were much more severe and long-lasting. My family had spent years building their reputation in the community, and they destroyed it all in one afternoon with their elaborate deception. Former friends wouldn't speak to them, neighbors avoided them, and they were essentially ostracized from the social circles they'd once been part of. Marcus's latest business venture collapsed when his partners found out about the fraud charges, and he couldn't find anyone willing to invest in his future projects. Jennifer lost her job when her employer decided that someone who would fake a family member's death couldn't be trusted in a position of responsibility. My parents had to deal with constant whispers and stares whenever they went out in public. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was that they lost any chance of ever having a relationship with me again. Their willingness to declare me dead and use my supposed death for financial gain showed me exactly what kind of people they really were. There was no coming back from that level of betrayal and manipulation. I eventually moved to another city to start fresh, but I kept in touch with a few family friends who made sure I stayed updated on the ongoing consequences of their actions. The story became legendary in our hometown, with people still talking about it years later as the most shocking family scandal anyone could remember. Looking back, I'm almost grateful that they pushed their manipulation to such an extreme level. If they just continued with their usual pattern of guilt trips and emotional blackmail, I might have eventually given in and tried to rebuild some kind of relationship with them. But by literally declaring me dead and trying to steal my inheritance, they showed me their true nature in a way that left no room for doubt or reconciliation. The irony is that they destroyed their own lives in pursuit of money that was never going to be theirs anyway. Grandpa Joe's will was ironclad, and their scheme was never going to work even if I had actually died. All they accomplished was ruining their reputations, facing criminal charges, and losing any chance of having me in their lives forever. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people reveal their true character and face the natural consequences of their actions. My family did all the heavy lifting for me. I just had to show up at the right moment to expose their lies and watch their house of cards collapse around them. The whole experience taught me that family isn't about blood relations or shared genetics. It's about the people who love and support you, who celebrate your successes instead of resenting them, and who would never dream of declaring you dead for financial gain. I found my real family among friends and chosen relationships, and I've never been happier than I am now, living my life free from toxic people who only saw me as a source of money or a convenient scapegoat for their failures. And every year on the anniversary of my fake death, I post a photo on social media with the caption, "Still not dead," just to remind everyone of the most ridiculous family scandal in our town's history. It never gets old, and I'm pretty sure it never will.